She disappeared less than a block from home, and no one saw anything. She didn't disappear while running. She didn't disappear at night. She didn't disappear somewhere people warn you about. She disappeared on a normal afternoon. That should make you angry. Because when 17-year-old Esme Ashcroft went missing in Phoenix in 2001, nothing about her day raised alarms. No arguments, no panic, no broken routine. Just a short walk home through a neighborhood people trusted without hesitation. That trust was a mistake. Esme had taken that route before, many times. Same sidewalks, same houses, same stretch of road where nothing ever happened. That familiarity didn't protect her. It exposed her. She made it almost all the way home, and then she was gone. No shouting, no struggle anyone remembers. No witnesses rushing forward afterward, just absence. An absence like this doesn't happen by accident. People want to believe disappearances require force. They don't. They require confidence. They require timing. They require someone who knows how to blend in. That's what makes this case hurt. Because if Esme could vanish here, in daylight, near her own front door, then safety was never guaranteed. It was assumed. And assumptions get people hurt. If this story makes you uncomfortable, that's not a bad sign. That's your instincts waking up. Ignoring cases like this doesn't make you calmer. It makes you unprepared. Subscribe now, because the people who didn't think they needed stories like this were the ones caught off guard. And if you're choosing not to subscribe, say why in the comments. What makes you think this couldn't matter to you? Esme didn't take a risk that day. She did what millions of people do without thinking. She followed her routine, the same shift, the same path, the same expectation that home would still be there when she arrived. That's the part people struggle to accept. Nothing unusual had to happen for her to disappear. No bad decision, no wrong turn, just repetition. Routine builds confidence. Confidence lowers caution. And caution is usually the last thing people give up, right before something goes wrong. Esme wasn't late. She wasn't avoiding anyone. She wasn't hiding plans from her family. She was moving through a space she believed belonged to her. That belief cost her everything. The truth is uncomfortable. The more familiar a place feels, the less alert we become. We stop scanning faces. We stop questioning movement. We stop noticing who's watching and who shouldn't be. That's not fear, that's human nature. And it's exactly what someone else can use. Whoever took Esme didn't need to rush her. They didn't need to scare her. They just needed her to feel normal. That's why this case stays unresolved, because it doesn't look violent. It doesn't look chaotic. It looks quiet. And quiet disappearances don't trigger alarms until it's already too late. If you think awareness comes from luck, you're wrong. It comes from paying attention. Stay here. This matters more than people admit. There was no scream. No neighbor heard a cry for help. No doors slammed. No sudden noise that made anyone look outside. That silence is the most disturbing part. People expect danger to announce itself. They expect chaos, speed, panic. But Esme's disappearance didn't need any of that. Whatever happened took place in seconds or minutes without raising suspicion. No broken items, no scattered belongings, no sign that she fought back. That absence tells its own story. It suggests control. It suggests timing. It suggests someone who understood how to move through that neighborhood without being noticed. And that should make you angry, because it means safety wasn't taken from Esme, it was assumed. Someone counted on everyone else staying distracted, on doors staying closed, on neighbors minding their own business, and they were right. Ask yourself something honestly uncomfortable. If this happened on your street, would you notice? Would you hear it? Would you recognize it? Or would you only realize something was wrong hours later, when it was already permanent? This isn't about paranoia. It's about refusing to pretend silence equals safety. If you're still watching and not subscribed, ask yourself why. Stories like this aren't entertainment. They're warnings. If you choose to ignore them, explain that choice in the comments. Because awareness doesn't arrive by accident. Esme Ashcroft didn't vanish in a dramatic way. She disappeared during a routine afternoon on a street that had never made anyone uneasy. The kind of place parents trust. The kind of place people defend when they say, That could never happen here. That belief is what failed her, because danger doesn't always force its way in. Sometimes it blends in. Sometimes it waits for familiarity to lower defenses. Esme was steps from home. She was where she belonged. She was doing nothing wrong. And yet someone found an opening. That's the truth people avoid, because it's uncomfortable, because it means safety isn't guaranteed by routine, location, or daylight. It means the warning signs aren't always loud. They're often quiet, easy to miss, easy to dismiss. And once they're missed, there's no rewind. If this story unsettles you, it should. Not to scare you, but to sharpen you. Ignoring cases like this doesn't make them rare. It just leaves you unprepared when patterns repeat. This channel exists so we don't learn too late. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. In 2001, silence didn't trigger panic. Phones stayed on kitchen walls. Messages were scribbled on paper. If someone didn't answer right away, it wasn't alarming. It was expected. People trusted time to correct itself. There were no apps showing last locations. No alerts asking if you arrived safely. Once you stepped outside, you were truly on your own, and that independence was treated as healthy, even necessary. Teenagers learned responsibility through freedom. They walked to jobs. They ran errands alone. They moved through their neighborhoods without feeling watched, tracked, or timed. Parents didn't hover because hovering wasn't part of the culture yet. Connection existed, but it was delayed. You called when you got home, not while you were on the way. You checked in later, not constantly. Gaps in communication were normal, not threatening. That gap is important, because when something went wrong, there was no immediate signal, no digital footprint updating in real time, no sudden silence notification. Absence had to be noticed by a human being, and that took time. In cities like Phoenix, that delay blended easily into routine. A late return didn't mean danger. It meant patience. And patience, when misplaced, can cost everything. Suburban Phoenix ran on habit. Mornings looked the same. Afternoons unfolded the same way. People learned each other's schedules without trying. You knew when the mail arrived, when kids walked home, when garages lifted and settled back down. That repetition created comfort. Parents trusted streets they had driven for years. Neighbors recognized footsteps on the sidewalk. A teenager heading home alone didn't stand out. It blended in. Familiarity softened alertness. Routine became reassurance. In these neighborhoods, safety wasn't enforced. It was assumed. People believed problems announced themselves loudly. Screams, crashes, visible trouble. If none of that happened, nothing must be wrong. So small deviations were easy to excuse. A late return meant chatting with a friend. A missed call meant a dead battery. An empty house meant plans changed. Every explanation sounded reasonable because the environment had taught people to expect reasonable outcomes. But routine also creates predictability. Routes stayed the same. Timelines stayed the same. Patterns repeated until they felt invisible. Anyone paying attention could learn them without effort. That's the uncomfortable truth about safe places. They don't remove risk, they disguise it. And when trust replaces caution, opportunity opens quietly, without force, without noise, without warning. When safety feels permanent, vigilance fades. In Phoenix at the time, people didn't believe danger could move quietly. Threats were imagined as obvious. Someone running, shouting, breaking rules. Anything subtle felt unlikely. That belief shaped decisions. Parents allowed freedom earlier. Neighbors stopped asking questions. Strangers passed through without scrutiny because nothing bad had ever happened before. The absence of past harm became proof that harm wouldn't arrive. But safety didn't come from protection systems. It came from habit. No cameras watched cul-de-sacs. No phones tracked locations. No alerts flagged missed routines. Once someone stepped out of sight, they simply disappeared into the gaps between assumptions. Those gaps were large. A teenager walking home alone wasn't seen as exposed. It was seen as normal, and normal rarely triggers alarm. That's why no one noticed anything wrong when Esme didn't reach her door. Nothing looked broken. No screams, no chaos, No visible threat, just absence. And absence is easy to ignore at first, especially in places that teach you nothing ever goes wrong. That's how blind spots form, not from ignorance, from confidence. Confidence that safety will always behave the way it has before. Phoenix in 2001 relied on something fragile for protection: familiarity. People believed that knowing your neighbors was enough, that recognition equaled safety, that if something felt wrong, someone would notice in time. But familiarity doesn't stop harm, it delays suspicion. The same faces passed by every day. The same cars rolled through the streets. Movement blended into routine so completely that no single moment stood out as worth remembering. When everyone looks like they belong, no one is questioned. This wasn't neglect. It was trust on autopilot. Teens were trusted to manage themselves. Adults trusted patterns more than instincts. If someone didn't come home on time, the first response wasn't fear, it was explanation. A late stop, a change plan, a simple delay. Those assumptions bought time, and time is what someone else needed. Protection wasn't built into the environment. It existed only as an idea, one reinforced by years of nothing happening. When that idea failed, there was nothing underneath it to catch anyone. No barriers, no witnesses ready to intervene, no systems prepared to react. Just people realizing, too late, that comfort had replaced caution. And comfort doesn't keep anyone safe. Esme Ashcroft was the kind of teenager adults described as steady, not flashy, not reckless, not loud enough to draw concern. She was 17, but she carried herself with a calm that made people lower their guard. Teachers trusted her to follow instructions without supervision. Neighbors trusted her to be where she said she'd be. Her friends trusted her plans because she didn't change them impulsively. Esme liked order, lists, schedules, familiar routes. She walked the same streets at the same times. She showed up early to work. She returned calls when she said she would. Those habits built a reputation that followed her everywhere she went. She's responsible, people said. She's got a good head on her shoulders. That reputation mattered. It shaped how others interpreted her absence later. Because when someone dependable goes missing, the first instinct isn't danger, it's disbelief. People search for reasons that don't involve harm, miscommunication, delays, misunderstandings. Esme didn't seek attention. She avoided drama. She didn't push boundaries just to see what would happen. Her sense of independence wasn't loud. It was quiet and earned. That's why no one questioned her routine that afternoon. And that's why no one was watching closely enough when it broke. Esme lived much of her life inward. While other teenagers chased noise and attention, she preferred quiet focus. She spent evenings with notebooks spread across her bed, sketching star maps and jotting down observations she never shared online. The sky gave her something steady, patterns that didn't shift with mood or gossip. She dreamed of studying astronomy or physics, not because it sounded impressive, but because it felt honest. She wanted work that required patience, precision, time. Esme talked about leaving Phoenix one day, not to escape, but to learn. She imagined herself somewhere cooler, somewhere darker at night, where the stars felt closer. That future mattered to her. She planned for it carefully. That planning is important. She saved money. She researched schools. She filled notebooks with ideas instead of packing bags. Runaways act on impulse. Esme prepared for the long term. She didn't chase risk. She measured it. Her independence wasn't defiance, it was discipline. She wanted freedom, but she wanted it earned, not taken. Every step she imagined forward depended on stability at home, not disappearance. That's why what happened to her makes so many explanations collapse, because nothing in her inner world pointed toward leaving without a word. Esme's world was small, but it was solid. She didn't drift between friend groups. She kept a tight circle and invested in it fully. Her closest friends described her as loyal to a fault, the person who remembered birthdays, followed up after bad days, and showed up even when it was inconvenient. Teachers saw her the same way. She wasn't the loud achiever raising her hand for praise. She was the quiet student who turned in work early and stayed after class to clarify details. The kind educators didn't worry about. At home, trust wasn't negotiated, it already existed. Esme didn't need permission for every move because she hadn't given anyone a reason to say no. She checked in. She kept promises. She respected boundaries without being reminded. That trust shaped how her movements were interpreted. When Esme said she was walking home, no one followed. When she said she'd be back later, no one panicked. Nothing about her behavior suggested secrecy. There were no hidden relationships, no sudden shifts, no emotional volatility that might hint at escape or rebellion. That's what makes the silence afterward so loud. Every person who knew her well agrees on one thing. If Esme planned to leave, she would have told someone. And if she felt unsafe, she would have asked for help. Runaways leave trails. They take essentials. They disconnect slowly. They signal distance before they disappear. Esme did none of that. She left behind everything that mattered to her: her school materials, her notes, her savings. There was no packed bag hidden in her room, no missing clothes, no gaps in her plans. Her future was anchored, not unsettled. People who run are trying to escape something. Esme wasn't. She wasn't under pressure at home. She wasn't in conflict with her family. There were no escalating arguments, no sudden restrictions, no emotional breaks that might push her away. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. That distinction matters, because when a teenager vanishes, the word runaway becomes a shield. It delays urgency. It softens fear. It allows time to pass without action. Esme didn't disappear because she wanted distance. She disappeared because something interrupted her routine so completely that she never had the chance to react. That's why this case still matters. Because if someone like Esme, careful, trusted, consistent, can vanish without warning, then the assumptions people rely on for safety don't hold. And if they don't hold for her, they don't hold for anyone. The day Esme Ashcroft disappeared did not announce itself. It followed a pattern she had repeated dozens of times before. School in the morning, work in the afternoon. Plans made in pencil, not ink. Flexible, ordinary, safe. She woke up on time, ate breakfast, left the house without tension. There were no arguments left hanging in the air, no emotional weight dragging behind her. At school, nothing stood out. Teachers marked her present. Friends remembered casual conversations, homework deadlines, minor complaints about the heat. After classes ended, Esme headed to her shift at the coffee shop. She clocked in on schedule. Co-workers recalled her mood as calm, even upbeat. No distress, no distraction, no signs of urgency. This matters because disappearances often hide inside disruption. But this day had none. No sudden phone calls, no change in routine, no behavior that begged for attention. Everything about her movements said later, not last. And that's what makes this part so painful. Because the danger didn't arrive with noise or conflict. It arrived quietly, inside a normal afternoon that gave everyone permission not to worry. By mid-afternoon, Esme's movements were still fully accounted for. Her shift ended on time. The clock-out record confirmed it. Co-workers watched her grab her backpack and step outside into the heat, heading in the direction she always did. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. At approximately 3:25 p.m., she was seen again, this time by someone who had no reason to pay special attention. A neighbor watering plants near the cul-de-sac noticed Esme walking past, adjusting the strap of her backpack the way she often did. It was the last confirmed sighting. From that moment forward, the timeline fractures. No one reported seeing her reach her driveway. No one heard raised voices. No vehicle was reported speeding away. There was no disturbance that pulled eyes toward the street. Just minutes. That's all it would have taken. The distance from where she was last seen to where she should have been was short enough to cross while checking the time. A stretch so familiar it barely registered as movement at all. And somewhere in that narrow window, between ordinary steps and an unlocked front door, Esme vanished. What makes Esme's disappearance so difficult to process is how little time it required. There was no long gap. No unaccounted hour, no missing stretch of the day. The window was measured in minutes. From the last sighting to the moment her mother returned home, nothing happened that felt urgent enough to remember. Cars passed. Doors opened and closed. Neighbors stayed inside to escape the heat. Opportunity didn't need force. It didn't need speed. It needed familiarity. Someone could approach without raising concern. Someone could speak without triggering fear. Someone could redirect her path without a struggle loud enough to be noticed. That's the part people don't like to confront. We're taught danger looks obvious, aggressive, disruptive. But most harm doesn't arrive like that. It slips into moments where everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. Esme didn't disappear because she ignored a warning. She disappeared because there wasn't one. And when safety depends on warning signs, silence becomes the most dangerous condition of all. By early evening, nothing seemed wrong, at least not yet. Esme's mother arrived home expecting the usual signs of her presence. A backpack dropped by the door, music leaking from her room, some trace that the day had continued as planned. Instead, the house felt paused. Esme wasn't there. At first, concern stayed manageable. She might be nearby. She might have stopped to talk. She might be running late in the most ordinary way possible. Time passed. The explanations thinned. Calls went unanswered. The streets outside stayed quiet. As the hours stretched on, the absence stopped feeling temporary and started feeling wrong. There was no note explaining a change of plans. No message left behind to soften the delay. Just silence where routine should have been. That's when fear entered the room. Not loudly, not all at once. It arrived as a realization. Esme had never missed check-ins like this before. Not without telling someone. Not without accounting for herself. By the time authorities were contacted, daylight had already given way to darkness, and whatever opportunity had opened earlier that afternoon had long since closed. Esme Ashcroft hadn't come home, and no one knew where the search was supposed to begin. At first, the quiet didn't feel dangerous. Esme had been late before, by minutes, never hours. So the first missed check-in was brushed aside with patience. A delayed walk, a conversation that ran long, a harmless change of plans. But as the evening moved forward, the silence stretched. Calls went unanswered. Texts showed no reply. The kind of absence that usually corrected itself didn't. Her mother checked the house again. Her room was untouched. Nothing suggested she had come home and left. No discarded bag, no changed clothes, no signs of movement at all. That's when the worry shifted, because Esme didn't disappear without explanation. She didn't forget to check in. She didn't ignore messages when people were waiting on her. Every minute without contact chipped away at the excuses. The longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to justify it with reason. What had felt like patience started to feel like denial. Something was wrong, but naming it felt terrifying. People cling to normal explanations because the alternative demands action. And action means admitting that time is being lost. By the time the house felt truly empty, the fear wasn't loud yet, but it was rooted. The kind that doesn't fade when you tell yourself to calm down. This wasn't a late teenager anymore. This was an absence that refused to behave normally. The mind resists panic by bargaining with possibility. Maybe she stopped somewhere. Maybe a friend needed her. Maybe she forgot to charge her phone. Each explanation felt reasonable on its own. Together they formed a delay. Adults around Esme leaned on what they knew of her character. Responsible, consistent, careful. Those traits, meant to reassure, became a trap. They encouraged waiting instead of reacting. No one wanted to be the person who overreacted. Calling authorities felt dramatic, embarrassing even. What if Esme walked in 10 minutes later? What if concern turned into an apology? So time passed. Shoes were checked by the door, still there. Her backpack wasn't missing from its usual place. Her wallet hadn't moved. These details stacked quietly, one after another, until patience began to crack. Because Esme didn't travel light. She didn't leave essentials behind. She didn't wander off without preparation. The house told a story that words wouldn't. She hadn't planned to go anywhere. And that realization changed the tone of the night. The shift wasn't instant, it was heavy. The moment when waiting no longer felt responsible, when calm stopped feeling wise, because every assumption had failed, and when explanations collapse, fear doesn't rush in. It settles. The house began answering questions no one wanted to ask. Esme's phone charger was still plugged into the wall. Her school materials were untouched. The notebook she carried everywhere sat exactly where she'd left it the night before. Nothing suggested intention. Her favorite shoes were still by the door, the ones she always wore when she planned to be out longer than expected. Her savings envelope hadn't moved. Neither had her identification. People who leave by choice take pieces of their future with them. Esme took nothing. The absence of those items spoke louder than panic ever could. It stripped away comfort and replaced it with urgency. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't independence. This was interruption. At that point, the fear sharpened. It gained edges. It stopped asking when and started asking where. And more importantly, who. Because now there was no version of events where this made sense on its own. Esme hadn't stepped away from her life. Something had stepped into it. That realization landed with force. It reframed the silence not as delay, but as danger. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back to waiting. There comes a point when hesitation becomes dangerous. For Esme's family, that point arrived quietly, but decisively. The house no longer felt like a place she'd simply stepped away from. It felt abandoned in a way that didn't fit her. Calls were made again. Friends were contacted. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. Every answer closed another door. That's when the fear stopped being theoretical. This wasn't about being late anymore. It was about absence without explanation. Authorities were contacted, and with that call came a shift in tone. The situation was no longer contained within the family. It was real enough to require outside help. Even then, doubt lingered. Questions about age, independence, time frames, possibilities offered without urgency. The kind of responses that slow momentum at the exact moment speed matters most. But for those who knew Esme, the truth was already clear. Something had gone wrong hours earlier, and every minute spent explaining why this mattered felt like another minute slipping away. By the time the concern was officially acknowledged, the window for easy answers had closed. What remained was uncertainty, and the growing fear that whatever had taken Esme had already moved beyond reach. The note wasn't dramatic. That was the problem. It was found where no one expected meaning to hide, in plain view, not stuffed into a bag, not torn or concealed, just placed where it would eventually be seen, without urgency, without warning, short, casual, almost careless. "I'll be back soon." No time, no location, no signature that carried emotion. At first glance, it did exactly what it was designed to do: calm people down. Investigators would later admit that the note softened the response. It introduced hesitation where there should have been speed. It planted the idea that Esme had stepped away voluntarily, even briefly. But journalists covering the case noticed something else. The phrasing didn't match her habits. Esme didn't leave vague messages. She clarified. She accounted for herself. She understood that silence caused worry, and she avoided it. This note created the opposite effect. It removed urgency without offering clarity. The placement mattered too. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't emphasized. It sat quietly, as if meant to be found later, not immediately. As if time was part of its purpose. That detail alone raised an uncomfortable question. Was the note meant for her family or for investigators? Because if it wasn't written by Esme, then it wasn't reassurance, it was misdirection. Once the note was logged, its wording became the focus. 3 words: simple, neutral, almost comforting. But simplicity can be deceptive. People close to Esme struggled to explain why the message felt wrong. Not because it was alarming, but because it lacked her voice. Esme didn't write like this. She didn't rely on vague reassurance. She was specific, especially when plans changed. Journalists who reviewed the case picked up on the same tension. They compared the note to Esme's schoolwork, her messages to friends, even reminders she left for herself. Her writing carried structure. Even in casual moments, she clarified details. This note did none of that. No time frame, no explanation, no reason. It assumed trust without earning it. Investigators initially treated the note as evidence of independence, a teenager stepping away briefly. Nothing urgent, but that interpretation rested on a dangerous assumption that the writer and the victim were the same person. Once that assumption cracked, the note stopped feeling harmless. If Esme didn't write it, then someone else did. And that person understood just enough about her routine to know what would delay concern. The note didn't explain her absence. It controlled the response to it. And that subtle control redirected the case before it truly began. The note didn't just raise questions, it created camps. Some investigators treated it as proof of choice. A sign that Esme had stepped away intentionally, even if only for a short while. That view slowed everything. Search radius, urgency, assumptions about risk. Others weren't convinced. They focused on what the note failed to do. It didn't explain where she went. It didn't align with her habits. And most importantly, it appeared before anyone realized she was missing, not after. That timing mattered. Journalists covering the case pushed this angle early. They asked uncomfortable questions during briefings. Why assume the note was written freely? Why treat it as reassurance when it lacked detail? Those questions didn't always land well, because acknowledging doubt meant admitting the investigation might already be off course. The note became a pivot point. Every decision that followed leaned either toward patience or urgency, toward waiting or searching. And once resources move in one direction, pulling them back takes time. This wasn't about handwriting analysis yet, or fingerprints. It was about instinct, about whether to trust a message that asked for trust without context. The note didn't just complicate the case, it quietly decided how the first crucial days would be spent. And once those days were gone, no note, real or fake, could bring them back. Years later, the note still sits at the center of this case. Not because it explains anything, but because it explains how confusion began. Investigators eventually stopped treating it as reassurance. Journalists stopped treating it as harmless. Instead, it became evidence of timing, intent, and awareness. Someone knew how much delay mattered. Someone understood that a calm message could buy hours, sometimes days, without raising alarms. The note didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to sound plausible. And it worked. Early search efforts were narrower than they should have been. The sense of urgency arrived late. Leads cooled before they were even identified. All because one small piece of paper suggested everything was fine. That's the danger of misdirection. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And in missing person cases, whispers are deadly. If the note wasn't written by Esme, then it represents a person who acted early, thought clearly, and anticipated reactions. Someone who didn't rely on force, but on understanding people. That possibility changes how every other detail is viewed. It reframes the disappearance not as confusion, but as control. And that's why the note still matters, because it reminds us that the most damaging evidence isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's the thing that convinces everyone to wait. In the first days after Esme Ashcroft vanished, explanations came before evidence. Investigators leaned on what felt familiar: teenage independence, voluntary absence, a short break from routine that would resolve itself once pressure eased. These ideas didn't come from facts. They came from patterns seen before. But Esme didn't fit those patterns. Still, early theories have weight. Once spoken aloud, they guide decisions. Search areas shrink. Urgency dulls. Questions soften. Journalists tracking the case noticed this shift almost immediately. Press briefings focused on calm language. Words like likely and temporary replaced urgent and critical. The framing suggested patience instead of pursuit. That framing mattered, because every hour spent reinforcing an assumption is an hour not spent challenging it. The investigation started narrow. Attention centered on Esme's habits rather than interruptions to them. Interviews focused on whether she might have left, not on who had access to her last known movements. No alarms were triggered by the note. No rapid canvassing followed the final sighting. No immediate pressure was applied to close gaps in the timeline. Theories arrived early. Evidence arrived later. And once a direction is chosen, changing it requires proof. Proof that often disappears with time. This wasn't negligence. It was momentum, moving the wrong way. The investigation unfolded in a different world. In 2001, there were no location histories to pull, no real-time tracking, no social media timelines to retrace movements minute by minute. Phones existed, but they didn't tell stories the way they do now. Once Esme's phone went quiet, it stayed quiet. Investigators couldn't map her final steps digitally. They relied on memory instead. Human recall, already weakened by heat, routine, and time. By the time questions were asked, details had blurred. Faces merged. Moments slipped away. Journalists covering the case pressed on this limitation. They noted how quickly opportunities narrowed. Security cameras were rare in residential areas. Businesses overwrote footage within days. Transit records were minimal. The absence of data forced reliance on assumptions, and assumptions filled gaps too easily. Without immediate pressure, canvassing was slower. Witnesses weren't interviewed while memories were sharp. Vehicles weren't cataloged while descriptions were fresh. The delay wasn't intentional, it was structural. The system moved at a pace built for resolution, not urgency. And by the time urgency arrived, the trail had already cooled. This wasn't just about missing tools. It was about how much those tools now matter. Because once time passes, technology can't recover what hesitation erased. As days passed, assumptions began to harden. The idea that Esme had left willingly wasn't proven, but it lingered. It shaped questions. It softened urgency. It reframed concern as patience. Instead of asking who last saw her, attention drifted toward why she might leave. Instead of tightening the timeline, investigators widened the story. Every speculative reason became a substitute for evidence. Journalists following the case noticed this drift and pushed back. They highlighted contradictions. A girl who planned carefully, a note that lacked clarity, belongings left behind. None of it aligned with voluntary absence. Yet assumptions are comfortable. They reduce pressure, they slow momentum, they allow systems to operate without alarm. Witness interviews came later than they should have. Neighborhood canvassing wasn't exhaustive. Some potential leads were treated as background noise rather than signals. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together they created a gap, and gaps invite loss. Esme's routine was known. Her path was short, the window was small. Those facts should have narrowed focus immediately. Instead, focus diffused. When evidence is thin, instinct matters. But instinct, when shaped by comfort instead of caution, can mislead. And once the early days passed, certainty slipped further away. With each passing day, the case grew colder. The search efforts that began with urgency gradually slowed. Interviews were scheduled later than ideal. Evidence was preserved, but without the immediacy that could have made it meaningful. And once the initial wave of media attention waned, so did the pressure on local authorities. Assumptions had already set the stage for the next phase. The focus remained on Esme's personal life, her relationships, her possible desire to escape. That focus kept things manageable. But as days passed and more questions went unanswered, frustration began to build, especially for those closest to her. Esme's family fought against the creeping feeling that momentum was slipping. They pushed for more, but every request for action was met with the same delays. Law enforcement, operating under the weight of systemic limitations, kept going through the motions. The story was still fresh in the media, but the vital energy needed to sustain the investigation began to fade. Too many assumptions had been made in the early hours. Too many leads dismissed without a hard look. And now it was a waiting game. The most critical window for recovery had closed, and no one could get back the time that was lost. When someone vanishes without explanation, attention turns inward. Not because guilt is assumed, but because proximity feels relevant. The people closest to Esme became central to the story simply by being near her life, family, friends, co-workers, anyone who knew her routines. This is where tension begins. Esme lived in a household built on structure. Schedules mattered. Expectations were clear. Her home life wasn't chaotic, but it wasn't invisible either. Small disagreements existed, as they do in most families. Curfews, plans, responsibility. Nothing that pointed toward danger. Yet once she was gone, those ordinary details took on new weight. Conversations were re-examined, moments replayed, tone analyzed. Journalists covering the case noticed the shift immediately. Familiar faces were no longer just witnesses, they were narratives. Each recollection carried its own version of Esme. Calm, focused, independent, careful. But memory isn't static. People remember through emotion, through fear, through guilt over what they didn't say or do. That doesn't create lies, it creates variation. And variation in missing person cases creates suspicion even when no proof exists. Proximity invites scrutiny not because it's damning, but because it's accessible. And in Esme's case, closeness complicated the truth instead of clarifying it. As interviews continued, a problem emerged. No two recollections matched perfectly. Times shifted by minutes. Conversations were remembered differently. One person recalled Esme sounding relaxed. Another remembered her distracted. None of these differences were dramatic, but together they created uncertainty. Investigators understood this intellectually. Memory bends under stress. Fear sharpens some details while erasing others. But emotionally, those gaps became difficult to ignore. Journalists following the case noted how quickly small discrepancies were amplified. A sentence phrased differently. A pause remembered as longer than it was. Ordinary human error transformed into suspicion through repetition. This wasn't deception. It was grief colliding with pressure. Friends questioned themselves. Family members replayed their last interactions endlessly, searching for meaning that might not have been there. Every retelling added weight to moments that had once been insignificant. The danger here wasn't that memories conflicted. It was that the investigation began leaning on them too heavily. When timelines rely on recollection instead of confirmation, confidence erodes. Doubt spreads outward, touching people who were never part of any wrongdoing. And once doubt enters a close circle, it rarely leaves quietly. Instead of clarifying Esme's final hours, these conflicting memories blurred them, turning proximity into a liability rather than a guide. When clarity is missing, suspicion fills the space. People closest to Esme didn't become suspects because of evidence. They became suspects because of access, because they knew her routines, because they were present in her life when others weren't. Proximity creates questions even when answers don't exist. Investigators were careful with language, but the tension was unavoidable. Who spoke to her last? Who knew her plans that day? Who would have noticed a change in behavior first? None of these questions implied guilt, but they carried weight. Journalists covering the case noted how quickly the public narrative shifted. Familiar faces were examined with sharper eyes. Innocent details were revisited with suspicion layered on top. This created an ethical tightrope. Press too hard, and you risk damaging people already living with loss. Pull back too far, and you risk missing something critical. In Esme's case, there was no proof to anchor suspicion, no physical evidence, no contradictions strong enough to stand on their own, just gaps. And gaps don't accuse, but they invite accusation. Those closest to her felt that shift. Conversations changed tone. Answers were reinterpreted. Trust thinned under scrutiny. Not because anyone believed they were hiding something, but because uncertainty makes everyone feel exposed. As the investigation continued, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't a story with clear villains inside Esme's inner circle. There were no exposed lies, no breaking confessions, no moment where suspicion crystallized into proof. Just people carrying different versions of the same loss, each weighed down by questions they could never answer. Grief doesn't move cleanly. It distorts memory. It sharpens regret. It convinces people that one different choice might have changed everything. Those closest to Esme lived inside that mental loop, replaying ordinary moments until they felt unbearable. Journalists who spent time with the family noticed something striking. No defensiveness, no contradictions that escalated. Just exhaustion. This wasn't concealment, it was mourning under pressure. The danger in cases like this isn't accusing the wrong person outright. It's forcing people to live under suspicion when there's nothing solid to resolve it. Esme's disappearance didn't fracture her circle because of secrets. It fractured it because uncertainty has weight. And when answers don't arrive, that weight settles on everyone nearby. Quietly, permanently. No villains emerged here. Only people left behind, holding questions they never asked soon enough. In 2001, the internet didn't feel dangerous. It felt small, slow, personal. Most homes in Phoenix still shared one computer, usually in the living room. usually loud enough to announce itself when it connected. Parents didn't worry about what their teenagers were doing online because, to them, there wasn't much to do. No live tracking, no social feeds, no constant alerts, just message boards, chat rooms, email accounts that felt harmless. Esme Ashcroft spent time online, but not in ways that raised alarms. She wasn't hiding screens. She wasn't deleting histories. What she did online matched who she was offline. Quiet interests, niche spaces, conversations about stars, science, and writing. That's what made it easy to miss. Investigators initially treated the internet as background noise. They focused on streets, schedules, and familiar faces. Physical spaces felt more real than digital ones. And in 2001, that assumption was common. But one detail stood out to a few people paying close attention. Esme's email inbox hadn't gone silent after she vanished. There were messages marked as read. After the window when she was last seen walking home. Not replies, not new conversations, just opened messages. At first it was brushed aside. Computers stayed on. Family members clicked around. Nothing conclusive. But journalists reviewing the timeline years later noticed something unsettling. The read timestamps followed a pattern. Late afternoon, early evening, consistent spacing, not frantic, not random, intentional. Whoever accessed those messages knew where to look. They didn't explore. They didn't wander. They checked specific threads tied to Esme's interests. And then they stopped. No replies sent, no mistakes made, no digital footprint left behind. It suggested restraint, and restraint suggests choice. This is where frustration sets in, because the signs were there. Thin, fragile signs, but real ones. And without modern tools, without preserved data, without urgency, those signs slipped away. If this kind of blind spot exists now, imagine how many existed then. That's why staying informed matters. Awareness isn't entertainment, it's defense. If you're not subscribed, ask yourself why. And if you choose not to, say it plainly in the comments. Esme didn't talk to strangers online the way people imagine. She didn't seek attention. She didn't overshare. She didn't flirt. She talked about ideas, constellations, science fiction, short-form writing prompts, the kind of topics that attracted people who sounded thoughtful, patient, and safe. That's where the danger hid. In one archived forum thread, recovered years later through a private database maintained by early internet historians, Esme used a familiar username, the same one she used for school-related email, the same one friends recognized. She asked a simple question about star mapping in urban areas. Nothing risky, nothing revealing, but one reply stood out. Not because it was strange, but because it was precise. The response referenced Phoenix's light pollution patterns with unusual accuracy. It mentioned a rooftop view south of Camelback and suggested times when the city noise dropped enough to see faint clusters. That meant familiarity, not just with astronomy, with the city. Investigators at the time didn't connect it. Forums weren't considered leads. Digital conversations weren't treated as locations. But to anyone reading it now, the subtext feels obvious. Someone knew where Esme lived, or at least where she spent time. Someone shared her interests closely enough to gain trust without ever asking personal questions. That's how defenses lower, not through pressure, but through comfort. What makes this infuriating is how little it took. No lies, no fake identities, just patience. The forum account responding to Esme stopped posting 3 days after her disappearance. No goodbye, no explanation. The account was never traced. IP records were gone before anyone thought to preserve them. Another door closed before anyone realized it was open. Viewers often ask, why didn't anyone catch this sooner? Because the signs didn't scream. They whispered, and whispers get ignored until it's too late. That's what keeps people awake about this case. Not what we know, but what we almost knew. Once that online interaction was re-examined, the timeline stopped feeling loose. It began to compress. Esme's last confirmed online activity occurred the night before she disappeared, just after 10:40 p.m. A brief forum reply, no follow-ups, no casual scrolling afterward. That alone was unusual. She was known to read late. Not endlessly, but consistently. A final check before sleep. A habit. That night, the habit ended early. The next day, her movements lined up too cleanly. Leaving work, walking home. No detours, no sudden changes, no gaps wide enough to hide a choice, which forces a hard question. What if the decision wasn't made that afternoon? What if it had already been shaped quietly days earlier? Investigators later theorized that if someone wanted to intercept Esme without force, they'd need three things: familiarity, timing, and a reason that felt harmless. The online exchange provided all three. A shared interest lowers guardrails. Specific local knowledge builds credibility. And a casual suggestion, "I know a better spot," doesn't sound dangerous when it comes from someone who already feels known. Here's where the frustration sets in. There was no message arranging a meeting, no saved email, no printed proof. If something was said, it wasn't preserved. Early internet platforms didn't archive private replies. They vanished once viewed. So investigators were left staring at absence. Not a smoking gun, a missing frame. Yet the timing fits too tightly to ignore. The forum account goes silent. Esme's routine breaks once. A narrow window opens. She's gone. Every element sits just inside plausibility, never crossing into certainty. And that's what makes this unbearable for anyone trying to reason through it. The clues don't contradict each other. They refuse to complete each other. Viewers following this case often feel the same anger investigators described later. We're standing inches from an answer, but can't touch it, because nothing here proves intent. But everything suggests access, and access is often all it takes. In 2001, most families didn't think of the internet as a place where danger started. It was treated like a supplement to real life, a hobby space, a place for interest, not influence. That assumption mattered. Esme wasn't searching for attention. She wasn't chasing strangers. She was following curiosity, astronomy forums, message boards about star charts, late-night discussions that felt academic and harmless. And that's the trap, because risk isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives disguised as shared language. Investigators later acknowledged something uncomfortable. They had no framework for measuring online proximity back then. No sense of how quickly trust could form without physical contact. No tools to separate coincidence from grooming when everything looked polite. A person could learn her schedule without ever asking directly, could understand her routes without following her, could suggest a meeting point that didn't feel like a meeting at all. That's what makes this connection so hard to dismiss. Not because it proves anything, but because it explains how nothing looked wrong. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. Most people watching this would have ignored the same signs. Most families would have seen nothing alarming. Most teenagers would have felt safe. If you think stories like this are just content, you're missing the point. Awareness isn't entertainment, it's preparation. If this feels uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is useful. Subscribe now, not to be scared, but to be informed. And if you won't subscribe, say it out loud. Drop a comment and explain why staying unaware feels safer to you. Because cases like Esme's don't rely on force, they rely on gaps in understanding. And gaps are where people disappear. The search for Esme Ashcroft expanded quickly and unevenly. At first it followed logic. Routes she walked, places she knew, corners she passed without thinking. Volunteers combed the neighborhood in widening circles. Yards were checked, alleyways traced, drainage channels inspected under the harsh Arizona sun. Dogs followed scent trails that faded, restarted, then vanished again. That inconsistency unsettled everyone. If Esme had been taken nearby, something should have surfaced. A dropped item, a disrupted path, a sign she changed direction. But the map refused to cooperate. One search team reported scent movement toward a busier road. Another found nothing past her street. A third flagged a wash 2 miles away, but with no confirmation it was her trail at all. The geography didn't agree with itself. And that mattered, because geography doesn't lie unless someone interferes with it. This wasn't a clean disappearance, it was a scattered one. Each new grid added space, but no clarity. Each expansion made the absence louder. For those watching closely, a question formed early. Was the problem distance or direction? 3 days into the search, a volunteer found something that shifted the tone. It wasn't dramatic. No blood, no damage. Just Esme's canvas sneaker. It sat near the edge of a dry retention basin, nearly a mile from her usual route home. Clean, upright, not buried, not tangled in brush. Placed. That detail mattered more than the shoe itself. If she'd run, the shoe would show it. If she'd fallen, the ground would tell the story. If she'd struggled, something nearby would reflect that moment. But there was nothing. No scuffed dirt, no broken weeds, no drag marks. Just a single sneaker, resting where no one could explain why it belonged there. Search teams froze the area. Photos were taken. The shoe was bagged. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Why only one? Why that location? Why untouched? If Esme had been harmed nearby, there would be more. If she'd removed it herself, there would be reason. Neither appeared. For viewers paying attention, this was the first hard fracture in the case logic. Someone wanted something noticed, but not enough to explain anything. And that's when frustration turns sharp, because evidence without context doesn't solve cases. It only taunts them. Once the sneaker entered evidence, maps took over. Search coordinators spread large paper grids across folding tables. Every reported sighting, every recovered item, every checked trail was marked by hand. Lines were drawn, circles overlapped, arrows pointed in competing directions. Nothing lined up. If Esme had walked to the basin, it would have taken her far off course, away from both home and every place she usually went. No one could explain why she'd head there alone on a weekday afternoon without telling anyone. If she'd been taken, the location raised worse questions. The basin wasn't hidden. It wasn't remote. It wasn't logical. Any vehicle stopping there risked being seen. Any struggle would have echoed, yet nothing else surfaced. Search dogs were brought in. One picked up a scent briefly near the basin's edge, then lost it entirely. Another followed a path toward a nearby service road before stopping cold, confused. That inconsistency fueled arguments behind closed doors. Some believed the shoe was a diversion. Others thought it marked a transfer point. A few feared it meant something much simpler. The trail had already gone cold. For anyone watching from the outside, this was the moment anger set in. The clues existed. They just refused to align. And every day that passed without clarity made the silence louder. By the third week, the searches began to thin. Not officially, not on paper, but in practice. Fewer volunteers showed up each morning. The command center stopped buzzing before noon. Maps were no longer updated in real time. The urgency that once pushed people into the desert at dawn slowly faded into procedure. Authorities didn't say the effort was scaling back. They said they were shifting focus. That shift was visible in small ways. Helicopter flyovers became rare. Canine units were reassigned. Tip lines rang longer before being answered. To Esme's family, it felt like a retreat disguised as progress. Investigators still followed leads, but now those leads lived on desks instead of dirt. Phone records, notes, statements. Paper replaced footprints, and paper can't scream. Every search area eventually reaches a point where nothing new turns up. When that happens, logic demands a pause. Emotion refuses to accept it, because pausing feels like giving up. The desert hadn't changed. The streets hadn't changed. The danger that took Esme didn't announce it was done. Yet the noise surrounding the case grew softer. For anyone paying attention, this was another brutal truth. Disappearance cases don't always end with answers. Sometimes they end with silence that slowly convinces people nothing more can be done. And that belief, more than distance, more than heat, is what truly buries the trail. By the time the searches slowed, something else took their place: interpretation. When no new evidence appears, people don't stop thinking. They start deciding. Every confirmed detail from Esme Ashcroft's case was suddenly pulled in opposite directions, shaped into explanations that reflected fear, hope, or guilt more than proof. Some believed Esme chose to leave. They pointed to her age, 17, on the edge of adulthood. Old enough to want out. They argued that no struggle meant no crime, that silence meant intention. that the absence of damage suggested choice. Others rejected that idea outright. They focused on timing, on how little space existed between her last sighting and her disappearance, on the personal items left behind, on the risk of vanishing without preparation. They argued that leaving without notice wasn't independence, it was danger. Both sides used the same facts, and neither could prove anything. Investigators didn't endorse either view. They couldn't. Every theory explained one part of the story while breaking another. A planned exit didn't explain the gaps. An abduction didn't explain the lack of disturbance. That's where the case began to split people, not into those who knew the truth, but into those who filled the silence differently. The hardest part wasn't choosing which explanation felt right. It was realizing that feeling right didn't make it real. Because in cases like this, certainty isn't lost all at once. It fractures quietly until everyone is holding a different version of the same unanswered question. What made the divide sharper was how easily the evidence flipped. Take Esme's routine. To some, her consistency suggested predictability, a pattern someone else could study, anticipate, and exploit. The same walking route, the same time window, the same assumptions of safety. That kind of regularity doesn't protect you. It exposes you. But to others, that same routine suggested stability, responsibility, a life moving forward, not away. They argued that people planning to disappear usually change first. Behavior shifts. Habits break. Esme's didn't. Then there was the absence of struggle. One side treated it as proof of calm intention. No torn clothing. No witnesses hearing panic. No sudden disturbance. They argued that force leaves marks, and this left none. The other side saw something else entirely. They saw speed, a moment short enough to avoid noise, a situation that didn't allow resistance, a method that didn't need strength, only timing. Even the location worked both ways. A familiar street felt safe, too safe to raise alarms, too ordinary for anyone to watch closely. That comfort could mean freedom or vulnerability. Every detail pulled in two directions, and every time investigators leaned toward one explanation, another fact dragged them back. This is where frustration sets in, because when the same clues support opposing outcomes, progress slows to a crawl. Not because no one is trying, but because truth stops cooperating. The case didn't go cold from neglect. It stalled because certainty refused to exist. And that's the kind of mystery that keeps people arguing decades later, without ever moving closer to an answer. As the case dragged on, something subtle but dangerous began to happen. Logic lost its grip. When facts refuse to align, people don't stop searching for answers. They replace them. Emotion fills the gaps that evidence can't. Fear sharpens opinions. Grief hardens theories. And soon belief starts masquerading as truth. Some became convinced Esme was taken by someone she knew, not because of proof, but because it felt easier to accept. A familiar face made the chaos smaller, contained. If the threat had a name, then it could be understood. Others rejected that completely. They focused on the randomness, the timing, the brief window where a stranger could step in and vanish just as quickly. To them, the lack of a clear suspect wasn't comforting, it was the warning. Investigators felt this pressure too. Every interview carried weight beyond facts. Every pause, every contradiction, every emotion was read as meaning something more. But emotion isn't evidence, and chasing it risks losing the trail entirely. That tension between what feels right and what can be proven slowed everything. Leads were questioned, then re-questioned. Tips were followed, then dismissed. Nothing crossed the line from suspicion into certainty, and that's when frustration turned outward, toward the system, toward the silence, toward the unanswered space where Esme should have been. This is where cases fracture, not from lack of care, but from too many interpretations pulling at once. And once that happens, clarity becomes the rarest thing of all. No matter which explanation people lean toward, one problem refused to disappear: opportunity. For Esme to leave willingly, she would have needed time, privacy, and intent. None of those were confirmed. Her belongings stayed behind. Her plans were unfinished. Her routines were intact right up until they weren't. For her to be taken, The moment had to be precise. A narrow slice of time. A place with no witnesses, no raised voices, no struggle that anyone could hear or later describe. Both paths demand something uncomfortable. Either Esme made a decision that contradicted everything people knew about her, or someone else acted with perfect timing and complete confidence. Investigators circled this point again and again. They mapped distances, counted minutes, compared statements that were close but never clean enough. Every version of events required at least one leap that facts couldn't support, and viewers listening to this story feel it too. You can sense where the trail almost forms. You can feel when something is just one detail short of clarity. It creates a specific kind of anger, the kind that comes from knowing the truth is nearby but unreachable. That's what keeps this case alive. Not certainty, not closure, but the question that refuses to settle. How does a person disappear without breaking the world around them? Until that question is answered, every theory remains incomplete. Cases don't usually go cold in a dramatic moment. They cool slowly. At first, Esme's disappearance stayed active. Tips came in, sightings were reported, names were written down, crossed out, written again. Each call carried urgency, until the calls became less frequent, then uncertain, then speculative. Nothing stopped abruptly, it just thinned. People moved, memories softened, confidence in timelines weakened. Witnesses who were once sure about dates and times began adding qualifiers. I think, it might have been. I'm not completely sure anymore. That erosion matters more than people realize. Investigators depend on precision. When recollections lose edges, even honest ones become unreliable. A 10-minute window stretches, a direction becomes vague, a face turns into a feeling. There were still pieces on the board, but no way to lock them together. Leads didn't collapse under scrutiny, they simply refused to go anywhere. Each path ended the same way, plausible, troubling, and incomplete. And the most frustrating part? Nothing ever proved a direction was wrong. There was no single theory to eliminate, no confession to rule out, no discovery that shut a door for good. Everything remained possible, which meant nothing became actionable. That's how momentum dies, not from failure, but from indecision forced by missing facts. The case file grew thicker. The answers stayed thin. The year mattered more than people like to admit. In 2001, technology hadn't yet caught up to human curiosity. Phones didn't constantly report location. Cameras weren't everywhere. Online activity left fewer lasting traces. What seems obvious now simply didn't exist then. Esme didn't carry a device that tracked her steps. There were no automatic pings to follow, no digital breadcrumb trail to rewind. Once she stepped out of sight, the world stopped recording her movements. Security footage was scarce and often overwritten. Home computers were shared and rarely preserved. Internet activity, when it existed at all, lived on servers that no longer do. Investigators did what they could, but they were working in the dark compared to today's standards. Searches relied on memory instead of metadata. Leads were pursued with paper files and manual cross-checks. Patterns that modern software could flag instantly had to be noticed by tired eyes and overworked minds. This didn't mean people failed. It meant the tools failed them. Questions that could be answered today: who did she talk to last? Where did she linger? What route did she take? Remained permanently open. Every unanswered question widened the space where theories could grow without restraint. And the longer that space stayed open, the harder it became to close. Because time doesn't just erase evidence, it reshapes how evidence is understood. What made Esme's case especially cruel was that evidence did exist, just not the kind that speaks on its own. There were statements that didn't line up cleanly, timelines that overlapped but never locked together, small inconsistencies that raised eyebrows but couldn't stand alone in a courtroom, or even justify a decisive shift in direction. Each piece required context that never arrived, an object found where it shouldn't have been, a reported sighting that almost fit, a tip that sounded credible until one detail refused to cooperate. None of it was useless, but none of it was enough. That's the kind of evidence that exhausts everyone involved. It keeps hope alive while denying resolution. Investigators revisited the same materials again and again, hoping time would reveal what proximity could not. But without new information, old details only echoed themselves. The file didn't grow because of progress. It grew because of repetition. And repetition without clarity creates doubt, not just about suspects, but about direction. Was the right path ever chosen? Was something dismissed too quickly? Or was the truth always just outside reach? Those questions lingered quietly, not loud enough to force action, not clear enough to shut down. Eventually, resources were reassigned. New cases demanded attention. Esme's file was placed back on the shelf, not forgotten, but no longer moving forward, still waiting. As years passed, the case didn't just lose urgency, it lost access. People changed addresses, phone numbers disconnected. Records were archived, boxed, and moved. Some witnesses who once lived minutes away could no longer be reached at all. Others remembered less with each passing year, not because they didn't care, but because memory fades when it isn't reinforced. Time introduced distance, distance weakened accountability, and slowly the case slipped into a category no family ever wants to hear: inactive. This didn't mean investigators believed Esme would never be found. It meant there was nothing left to press against. No new pressure points, no fresh direction to test. Modern tools could have changed that. Location data might have narrowed her path. Digital records could have confirmed conversations. Cameras could have answered questions that witnesses could not. Today, small moments leave lasting trails. In 2001, they vanished as quickly as they happened. That gap between what was possible then and what is possible now is where frustration lives, because it suggests the truth wasn't unreachable. It was just early by years, early by technology, early by timing no one could control. And that's the quiet cruelty of cold cases. They don't always fail because no one tried. They fail because the moment passed before the world was ready to catch it. When a case ends without answers, the loudest thing left behind is silence. And silence always benefits someone. In Esme's disappearance, there was no public collapse, no panic that forced mistakes, no sudden break that drew attention to the truth. The days passed. The neighborhood returned to routine. Life adjusted around the absence. That alone raises a hard question. Who needed things to stay calm? Because crimes that succeed without noise rely on one advantage above all others: cooperation from the environment, familiarity, predictability, a setting where people assume nothing is wrong because nothing looks wrong. No doors were forced, no alarms triggered, no one ran screaming into the street. That kind of outcome doesn't happen by accident. It requires someone who understood timing, someone who knew when people looked away, someone confident enough to act without drawing notice, and patient enough to let silence do the rest. Investigators never found evidence of panic on the other side of this story. No rushed decisions, no sloppy aftermath. Whoever was responsible didn't scramble to fix a mistake. They didn't need to. And that's what unsettles people who study this case. Because most wrongdoing leaves friction. This left none. The quiet didn't just follow Esme's disappearance. It protected it. Most cases break because someone slips. They talk too much. They act too fast. They leave something behind. Even careful plans usually crack under pressure. That never happened here. There was no sudden confession, no misstep that exposed intent, no moment when the story bent under its own weight. Every path investigators followed ended the same way: plausible, troubling, and incomplete. That consistency matters. It suggests that whatever occurred wasn't reactive. There was no scrambling afterward, no frantic effort to control damage. The lack of correction implies confidence. Confidence comes from preparation. But preparation doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing the right moment, the right place, the kind of environment where attention is low and assumptions do the work. The most frustrating part is that this doesn't point clearly to one person. It points to a type. Someone who didn't need to overpower. Someone who didn't need noise. Someone who relied on people doing what they always do, trusting routine. When mistakes don't appear, investigations stall, because you can't chase what never breaks pattern. That's why this case still feels unfinished, not because it's chaotic, but because it's too controlled. People want danger to be obvious. They expect it to shout. to rush, to leave damage behind that confirms fear was justified. When harm doesn't look like that, it gets dismissed, overlooked, explained away. That expectation may be the most dangerous part of this story. Nothing about Esme's disappearance matched what people are taught to watch for. There was no dramatic confrontation, no scene that forced neighbors to intervene, no sign that something urgent required attention. Everything stayed ordinary, and that's the point. Threats that blend into routine don't need permission. They don't need isolation or chaos. They rely on moments where trust replaces caution, where familiarity dulls instinct. That's why this case refuses to fade. It challenges the belief that harm must be loud to be real, that danger arrives with warning signs anyone would recognize. Here, the absence of alarm became the advantage. Esme didn't vanish because people ignored red flags. She vanished because there weren't any. And that truth lingers long after files are closed. Because if wrongdoing can happen quietly, without forcing itself into attention, then safety isn't just about awareness of risk. It's about understanding how easily normal can be used against us. That question doesn't belong to the past. It follows every quiet street, every routine walk, every moment we assume nothing could happen. Esme Ashcroft was 17 years old. That fact doesn't change with time. It doesn't soften. It doesn't age out of relevance. No matter how many years pass, she remains a teenager whose future was interrupted without explanation. When cases like this go unresolved, there's a temptation to let them fade into statistics, to treat them as history instead of responsibility. But forgetting doesn't bring peace. It only creates permission for the same gaps to exist again. Remembering Esme isn't about obsession with the unknown. It's about refusing to normalize absence. Her story matters because it exposes how fragile certainty really is, how quickly routine can be interrupted, how easily silence can replace accountability when attention moves on. Cold Case archives exist for this reason, not to dwell on darkness, but to keep memory active, to remind us that unanswered questions still deserve space, that families don't stop waiting just because the world stops asking. Awareness is not fear, it's clarity, and clarity is what keeps patterns from repeating unnoticed. As long as Esme's name is spoken, her disappearance isn't complete. It remains unfinished business, shared by everyone willing to listen, question, and remember. There's a reason stories like Esme's make people uncomfortable. They don't offer neat endings. They don't reward optimism. And they don't let the audience walk away feeling protected by distance or time. But choosing to engage anyway is not weakness. It's courage. Awareness doesn't mean living on edge. It means understanding patterns before they repeat. It means recognizing how ordinary settings can create false confidence, and how responsibility begins with paying attention. Cold Case Archives is built on that belief, not that the world is unsafe, but that understanding it makes us stronger, that knowing how harm can occur quietly gives people tools, not anxiety. Confidence grows from knowledge, not avoidance. Every time a viewer listens closely, asks hard questions, or refuses to dismiss unresolved stories, they push back against the idea that silence equals closure. That matters. Because progress doesn't always come from breakthroughs. Sometimes it comes from sustained attention, from communities that refuse to let unresolved cases disappear into background noise. You don't honor victims by being afraid. You honor them by staying aware, informed, and engaged, especially when answers are missing. That's how accountability survives time. Stories like Esme Ashcroft's don't end when the video does. They continue in how we respond to them. Responsibility isn't about solving a case from a screen. It's about refusing to look away when something doesn't sit right. It's about choosing to stay informed instead of assuming distance equals safety. That choice matters, because when people stop paying attention, silence grows comfortable, and comfortable silence is how patterns repeat without resistance. Cold Case Archives isn't here to frighten you. It's here to remind you that awareness is an active decision, one that says, I care enough to notice, one that says, I won't let unanswered stories vanish just because they're inconvenient. Subscribing isn't about entertainment. It's about staying connected to stories that still carry weight. It's about being part of a community that values clarity, memory, and responsibility over indifference. If you believe ignoring these stories has no cost, ask yourself this: who pays that cost when attention disappears? And if you're choosing not to subscribe, say it out loud in the comments. Explain why you'd rather step away than stay aware. Those conversations matter too, because the only wrong response to unresolved stories is pretending they don't concern us.